Well, welcome in everybody to the College Football Playoff Top 25 live reaction show right here on the 3 Technique channel. I'm Trey Reeves. I'm joined by Garrett Turney. We are T-minus 19 days away from Selection Sunday, and storylines abound as we enter into Week 13. Reese Davis has some fancy graphics behind him on a green screen, and we're probably a few minutes away from the first iterations of these rankings, the first iterations of this week's rankings. Coming up on our screen on ESPN, Garrett, lots to talk about. A lot happened. We did not get to discuss BYU losing in the late window because that was happening as we were recording our live show on Saturday night. So as we're waiting for these first few rankings to drop here, just some quick thoughts on that BYU-Kansas game. What did you see? What did you experience in that one? And how far are you expecting BYU to drop now that they've lost a game to a now 4-6 Kansas Jayhawks team?
Yeah, I don't think I was so impressed with Kansas necessarily as much as I was just disappointed in BYU. Just some knucklehead decisions down the stretch in that one. Very confusing play calls, when you had the opportunity to win this one. But at that point, it doesn't matter. They've lost. At this point, I think they've played their way outside of just winning the conference, right? I think there was always the slimmest margin that if things shook out the right way and, they were in a good spot leading into it, maybe a one loss, you lose your conference championship game, BYU, maybe they would find a way in, right? But I don't think at this point with the loss on their schedule, they're going to be able to get in outside of just winning their conference. So they've certainly made it harder on themselves. In terms of this week's rankings, I think they're going to get walloped. I kind of think they're going to fall outside the top 12. I don't think it's entirely fair, but I do think they'll end up falling outside the top 12. The committee really seemed sort of, I guess, hesitant to put them up as high as they were going into last week. Obviously, they worked their way up to 6. I kind of feel like they're going to fall out of the top 12 at this point.
I'm right there with you. I'm expecting them to be around. Shout out, Christopher. Thank you for the subscription. Appreciate that, man. Join the chat if you are watching live tonight. Let us know your thoughts as these rankings come out. I'm right there with you, though, Garrett. I think that BYU is going to be in some trouble following these rankings, and the Big 12 as a whole is going to be in some trouble. The biggest play in that game, ironically, was a punt, right? Just going back to that game as we were killing time while they're yet again explaining the 12-team college football playoff to us like we're 5 on ESPN.
It's okay. All of our fans know how the playoff works because they're not casuals and bums.
If you don't, ESPN's explaining it right now, and they're doing an infographic, so you got it. A Jalen Daniels pooch punt was the biggest play of the game, Garrett, as he executed it to near perfection. It goes off the helmet of the BYU gunner. They try to recover it, but they can't. And Kansas, it sets them up for the game-winning touchdown in that one. So
at the end of the day, look, we all knew, or at least I knew, that Kansas was going to be beating all the top teams in the Big 12 this year and competing in those games. I knew this. No doubts. Kansas has done exactly what I thought they were going to do.
Well, they've been so close all year, and we don't need to make this into a Kansas referendum here, but again, we're killing time.
Yeah, we're going to lead off the playoff show with a bunch of talk about Kansas.
Well, as we should, because they created the biggest storyline last week. But Kansas, they had been playing they hadn't been playing their best, but they've been playing close games against good teams. And it finally broke through for them in a big game in Provo. And it just so happened it might have really put their conference in a bind. So my bold prediction tonight, Garrett, is we're still waiting for these first set of rankings to be released. We now got the full shot of the table. The whole gang's there. My bold prediction tonight is the Big 12 is going to drop out of the first 4 buys, the top 4 buys. We will not see a Big 12 team in the top 4 seeds. We will, of course, see a Big 12 team in the playoff because the top 5 conference champions get in. But that's my bold prediction tonight, Garrett. I think that Boise State will be the 4 seed rather than whatever Big 12 team finds themselves ranked highest. Would love to know your bold prediction tonight.
Gosh, I hope you're right. I'm going to throw this up as a bold prediction real quick from Christopher in the comments. Kansas will upset Colorado this weekend. Look, please, Christopher, your lips to God's ears. We're begging for more chaos. And that's not just because, we like to trash on Colorado from time to time. And they have been playing better, and they've made it easier to root for them. But, man, Kansas is just a fun team. I'm a little bit of the Kansas juice from the earlier part of the season, and they've let me down. But if they can make some noise here at the end of the year, just to kind of muck everything up in the Big 12, that would be a lot of fun. I like your hot take there. I think my hot take is, I don't know if this is necessarily that hot of a take, but I just feel like the SEC is going to stay in that bottom group, and they're going to have maybe 5 or 6 SEC teams in a row. I think you're right about Boise. I think they're going to try to find a way to slide them up. I don't know that SMU gets a lot of love after what had just happened over the weekend. Still in a great position, obviously. The Mustangs can still win their conference and get the auto bid, and no problem. But I think there's a chance that after what just happened this last weekend, you could really see, like, Alabama followed by Georgia, followed by Ole Miss, followed by Tennessee, maybe followed by A&M, all in just kind of one big group right there at the bottom. Because right now, I don't think they really want to fix their problem, right? They've painted themselves into an unfortunate corner by the way that they've ranked these teams. I think that we're going to be in a spot where, they're going to want to put all the SEC teams kind of lingering around that cut line so they can make their call at the end of the season after all these games play themselves out.
It's going to be fascinating. That is the other big storyline tonight. How do they sort out the 2-loss SEC teams, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Ole Miss, that have all kind of beat each other up? We're running live with rankings now, Garrett. We've got 2 teams in, Illinois at 25, UNLV at 24. Important because it gives a couple teams another top 25 win. Missouri is going to stay in the top 25 at 23. That's also important because
I cannot believe that Missouri is still ranked. What is happening?
Iowa State back in at 22, and we will see what 21 flashes up on the screen here. But all 3 of those bottom 3 there, 25 through 23, Missouri, UNLV, and Illinois at 23 through 25, very important because they are going to give some narrative building, and Arizona State will come in at number 21. So those bottom 3, though, Garrett, that gives some teams an extra top 25 win.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly helps, like thinking just off the cuff, a team like A&M and a team like Bama, who both beat Missouri. And, that certainly helps their resume now, getting that extra top 25 win. That's going to help both of those teams down the stretch. I'm trying to think of who else in that group. I guess Iowa State's going to help some Big 12 teams.
UNLV will help Boise State a little bit.
Yeah, UNLV helps Boise's case.
Illinois helps the entire Big Ten that's beaten them.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Penn State, that gives them a quality win. Tulane moves up 5 spots after their dismantling of Navy up to number 20.
And by the way, they deserve it. Tulane's playing extremely good football and I think is one of the better G5 teams.
In position to be in position. 19 Army up 5 spots as well. That is the locked-in American Conference Championship game. So obviously those 2 teams need to win to keep their playoff hopes alive still, but they are already locked in. South Carolina up 3 spots to number 18 in the rankings.
And by the way, South Carolina is on an absolute tear at the end of the season. They have found something with Shane Beamer recently. They I don't know what happened, but they found something. They are playing extremely good football here to end the season. Wouldn't be shocked if they beat Clemson to finish the season.
Clemson will catch number 17, and Colorado will be number 16. If you're watching live, yes, I did just take a picture of the rankings so I can have it for my notes later because they're not very quick at uploading it online. So Colorado at number 16, they will not be the highest ranked Big 12 team. So BYU will retain that title. We still wait to see how far BYU falls. Again, that American Conference matchup, Texas A&M at number 15. So I think we're going to see BYU here at 14.
That makes a lot of sense. Probably slide SMU up one.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see here at 14. But A&M standing pat at 15. There they are. BYU down 8 spots to number 14. Garrett, is that fair?
I guess so. I mean, I think you're lacking BYU a little too much. I know that the quality wins haven't always been there, but they played extremely good football. I guess that makes sense. It's really unfortunate because I think it does kind of open up what you're talking about to be right. Where the auto bids may just not be there. I guess we're just saying that that's not the case, and that they're not going to be in a spot to be in one of those top 4 auto bids, and maybe they're out now at this point.
Well, that they're not going to be out, but they're in a precarious position as a conference if the American champion is an undefeated Army that beats Notre Dame, right? and they have a 2-loss. So SMU moves up to 13. Ironic because, yes, BYU beat SMU week 2, but that was a long time ago. And listen, head-to-head matters, but it's going to be really interesting to see how head-to-head in November carries weight versus head-to-head in September, like that BYU.
Well, and the committee has shown in the past to not care so much about that. Now, I know that they say that they're treating each year as separate. That's not true, obviously. But, in the past, they've been able to do just that, right? They've been able to find their way to, saying, hey, September games don't quite mean as much as November games because you can improve. I do think these are two programs that are still very good. I would like to see that game again, honestly. I'd like to see them play this one again and see who could come out on top now.
Boise State in at number 12, so they will be the 4 seed in this iteration of the bracket. It will be the Big Ten, SEC, and ACC champions, and Boise State will be slotted in the 4 seed when they show that bracket. Tennessee in at number 11, they are punished for their loss to Georgia on the road by dropping 4 spots. So it looks like, and Georgia's up to number 10, looks like it's going to be who's lost last, Garrett, for the SEC, unless they switch Alabama and Ole Miss here.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that. I guess there it goes, Ole Miss coming in at 9. So, I mean, like I said, there's probably going to be a logjam. I'd be shocked if 8 isn't Bama here. But yeah, I think it's just going to be a logjam at SEC teams kind of in that bottom half.
8 might be Notre Dame.
I guess, 8 could be Notre Dame. That's not awful. Oh, 8 is not Notre Dame, nor is it Alabama.
Miami. Okay. So Miami will be in that 3 seed spot, even though they are ranked number 8.
Yeah.
But
I think the big loser obviously being Tennessee, because they do lose that game to Georgia. They got punished for it, and everyone else just kind of moves up a little bit. They stay in, but man, Tennessee is right on that cut line. And if they can't, somehow find a tiebreaker that finds them into Atlanta, I'm curious to see if their wins down the stretch keep them in.
They're going to need some help, I think, to get to it. They're going to need a lot of help to get to Atlanta. Notre Dame checks in at number 6. So 10 through 6 in order: Georgia, Ole Miss, Miami, Alabama, and Notre Dame. That's counting down 10 to 6. But that's the solution for the SEC conundrum, I guess. Who lost most recently, right? So Georgia's at the bottom of that rung, and there's a little bit of a head-to-head element, of course, with Ole Miss and Alabama.
Well, and I think at a certain point you have to honor getting to the SEC championship as well. So whichever teams end up in Atlanta should be teams that end up in the playoff, right? So if it's going to take knocking Tennessee out to make sure that, somebody else gets, if it's, Georgia finding their way somehow there, I think is Georgia eliminated officially from Atlanta? I don't know if it's official or if it's just a tiebreaker.
No, there are no eliminations if you have 2 losses, because all hell could still break loose.
I feel like there's just
Alabama, A&M could lose to Auburn, and Texas could lose to Kentucky. I think
that I guess those are both on the table.
One of those is way more plausible than the other. And it would be the A&M losing on the road.
Sure, right.
Kentucky has gone into a top team's house.
Kentucky beat Ole Miss, so that's a possibility.
And they've not
but I just think at a certain point you have to be willing to kick somebody in favor of somebody else, which is why they're going to sit everybody down at the bottom so that they can make their decision in a couple weeks.
Penn State checks in at number 4, Texas at number 3. No change in the top 5 so far. We will not see any change in the top 5 as Ohio State checks in at number 2. And Oregon, despite struggling with Wisconsin on the road this Saturday, will retain their number 1 spot, rightfully so. They're 11-0. They're the only 11-0 team in the country. They deserve, and they're idle this week, so they will still be number 1.
Yep.
As they, and maybe there's a case for Indiana if they beat Ohio State.
Maybe Indiana beats Ohio State by 20, and then they're like, well, that was pretty convincing.
I still think Oregon would hold on to that number 1 spot, even if that were the case. But maybe it'd be an interesting discussion next week with Oregon off. So as we work to get the college football playoff bracket up on the screen, Garrett, just want to get your overall thoughts here. The floor is yours as I let you stall for me as I make sure the bracket's correct.
Yeah, well, so so initial takes. Obviously, kind of what I said with the SEC logjam that's in existence. That's going to sort itself out because someone's going to end up in Atlanta. Someone's going to end up with another loss. There's going to be teams that lose down the stretch, and that's going to help sort itself out. I respect the committee for putting Boise up there, despite the BYU loss. I think that that's a lot of respect to saying, hey, Boise State's played a pretty good schedule. They've done what they needed to do. I respect them for doing it, and not just committing to saying, hey, there's the kind of traditional Power 5 turned into Power 4. I respect that. It's still so goofy to me to see some of those teams up there. Still, I understand how the playoff works. It just is goofy to see like number 12 Boise getting the bye or like number 8 Miami getting the bye. It doesn't feel right necessarily off the bat. And then you see like number 2 Ohio State, and they're having to play that. So it feels weird from a guy who just looks at brackets and like we've done like March Madness, right? So I'm like 1 is at the top, and then 2 is at the bottom, and then you work your way. It's still weird to see some of those numbers, but overall, I respect it. Like I respect what they've done. I respect the order that they put everything in. Right now, what it looks like is we're going to have Boise State getting the winner of, if this were to hold, Boise State would get the winner of Ohio State BYU. And I think that puts Ohio State squarely in the semifinals with almost no resistance whatsoever. That would be, an absolute gift to the Buckeyes. And yeah, always talking ball. Want to shout them out. Ohio State with the much easier path than Oregon in this bracket. That is 100% sure, because Oregon gets the prize of I guess playing the winner of Alabama Notre Dame. And that is certainly not the same thing as either BYU or Boise State. So that's, you get the bye if you're Oregon, but that's certainly not a gift. Miami would get absolutely.
Just to jump in real quick, that's what people were kind of pointing out in the preseason, right? There was that big argument that the 5 seed might be the golden parachute in this format, because you're probably looking at a conference championship loser, and your reward for losing the conference championship game is, okay, well, you get a home game against, on paper, the worst conference champion that gets in, and then your next game is a neutral site game against the second worst conference championship champion that gets in.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I like too is, obviously, so I'll finish the bracket, then I'll go on that thought. You have Miami, obviously, with the bye. They would get Georgia, Penn State. Whoever wins that game is going to trounce Miami, I think, at this point. I think either Georgia or Penn State would dismantle the Canes at this point. And then really the kind of fun part of the bracket, I think, is at the very bottom. You get Texas with the bye. They would have Ole Miss versus Indiana. They have the winner of that game. I think that's really fun. I think that would be a fun, like any of those 3 would be really, really fun. Here would be kind of my thing, and sort of my thoughts on some of this would be, I wonder if going forward, because of that idea with the whole golden parachute, I wonder if they would consider a quarterfinal reshuffle and saying, regardless of what happened that first time around, we're not going to, punish, number 1 by making them, play 8 or 9 against, versus like, number 4 having to take 5, and then 5 was just like a conference champion loser. But, it's in this case, it's Ohio State, like a very good team. So, yeah, it'd just be really interesting to see how that would all play out, if they would consider a reshuffle at some point. But I do want to shout out our boy Mitch. I know he can't be here tonight, but this might be the most coherent playoff ranking in sports history. They're rewarding wins and losses right now. Like it's true that right now they're rewarding the wins. They're keeping people in order. And I think that that's good. I think it's good to reward that right now. Definitely appreciate that. Obviously, with Tennessee and SMU being those first couple teams out, that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense that those teams would be out in this current format, but with the chance to play themselves in, right? They do have the chance to play themselves in. If BYU finds a way to drop all the way out, right? If they find their way all the way out of this thing, Tennessee could rise back up into this. If one of the SEC teams drops, right? Like Ole Miss could drop Egg Bowl. Georgia could drop the game to Georgia Tech. Crazier things would have happened. Iron Bowl, anything can happen. So in any of those cases, you might see Tennessee rise their way back up. SMU, same thing. SMU can play themselves in by winning the ACC. Possibly even some other weird tiebreaker scenario, or, a team drops out. Again, SMU could find their way back in. But, lots of cool comments in the chat. Going to kind of address a couple of things. Maybe we answer a couple of these questions. Number 1, like this, is Texas in at 10-2? I'm assuming that means they lose to A&M at the end of the season. I'm assuming we're not saying that they lose to Kentucky then beat A&M. I'm assuming it's the loss to A&M I think Texas at 10-2, that's a really interesting conversation because they have kind of a similar thing with Indiana where you have to look around and say, well, who's their best win? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you have any thoughts on sort of what Texas does 10-2.
Well, let's get the graphic up here. So the graphic's ready, and thank you so much, Garrett, for
you're all good. You're all good.
Appreciate that. But there, if you're watching online, you can see the graphic. If you're listening to this on the podcast later on, you've probably seen it by now. But yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion this week about strength of schedule. There's a lot of discussion this week about SEC versus Big 12. If Indiana drops a game, do they deserve to be in over a 10-2 SEC team that played more difficult competition? Man, that discussion is so far above my pay grade, and it's going to be so maddening until we get, I think, a formula similar to the BCS or the RPI, what we have in other sports. But a 10-2 Texas is going to be a fascinating case for the committee, especially if there is a 10-3 Texas A&M that lost to an Alabama or something like that. It's really hard for me to justify if Texas is 10-2. It's really hard for me to justify them getting an at-large spot over some other teams because of their record against teams that have a pulse, right? Like if they're 10-2, they wouldn't have beaten a single team unless they somehow lose to Kentucky and then turn around and beat A&M. But in this scenario, we're talking about them losing to Texas A&M. So if a 10-2 Texas team that lost to Georgia at home and lost to Texas A&M on the road, unless by some miracle Vanderbilt ends up in the top 25 on the last poll, they're not going to have a top 25 win.
Yeah.
And I know you can make that argument with Indiana as well if they go 11-1, and we're not talking Shikey, I think that's your name. We're not talking about A&M right now. We're talking about Texas. So we're talking about a scenario where Texas would be A&M's best win. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to justify that. And you're going to be splitting hairs between a bunch of relatively equal teams, and you're just going to be leaving it up to committee. Obviously, the best way for Texas or A&M forward is going to be to win out, to beat the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you win the SEC championship game, then you're in automatically, and it doesn't matter. But if you're sitting there as a Texas Longhorn team at 10-2 without a win over a top 25 team, I don't know. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to be hard to justify that over a 10-2 Tennessee with an Alabama win. It's going to be hard to justify that over a 10-2 Alabama with a Georgia win. It's going to be hard to justify that over a 10-2 Georgia that beats you head to head. And it's going to be really hard to justify it over a 10-2 or a 10-3 Texas A&M that only has an extra loss because they had to play an extra game.
Yeah, it's the hard thing about this is I think Texas and A&M are currently in sort of a dichotomy right now where it's saying, like, right now, it all just depends on that last game of the season, right? Their best win is going to be the last game of the season for either of them. And outside of that, there's just a lot of teams that are kind of shaky. There's maybe a loss that's hard to explain on there. And if they lose, either team that loses is going to have a really hard time justifying how they're going to find their way in, right? It's going to be easier for Texas because they started more highly ranked. So like, it's going to be harder to drop them all the way out from, I guess they're at 3 right now, going to, have to drop them from 3 all the way out of the playoffs. It's going to be really hard to do. Probably not something the committee wants to do, but at the same time, it's, and I understand the point that's getting made in chat right now is there's a lot of circular happening in the SEC. The unfortunate thing is the SEC is kind of doing what the Big 12 has done in the past, where teams are just kind of cannibalizing each other. And that has to do with the fact that this year in the SEC, there's lots of good teams. It's really hard to pick the elite team, right? I don't think you can look at any of the teams right now in the SEC and say any of them are definitively elite way more than they have been in the past, right? There's not any of the previous Georgia teams from the last couple of years. Those teams don't exist right now. It's not 2020 Bama. It's not 2019 LSU. Like, those teams don't exist right now in the SEC. Lots of teams are very good, but then have a flaw or something that's really going to be a problem, or even just, haven't been at that elite standard to really, push their way in and say, yeah, we are this team. When we walk into your stadium, you should be afraid, right? I think really the home team has kind of had advantage in a lot of these games. Obviously some road wins have happened, but there've been a lot of home upsets of teams just because, there's not that many elite teams this year. So I think you see that in what the committee's done in putting the SEC in the bottom half of this bracket. I'm looking across and I'm trying to go and check this, just looking at the bracket one more time. Yeah, none of these SEC teams would host first round.
Right. And
You
I
have
think that's
Alabama, Ole Miss, and Georgia all on the road. Texas obviously getting the bye for winning the conference. So,
and I think the
you really
message
have
there, Garrett, I think the message there from the committee is, hey, if you're really big and bad SEC, go win the first round game on the road. And if you're really the best conference in the country, you're going to go prove it on the field in the playoff by winning on the road. And the problem that there's going to be an odd man out in the SEC. I really don't think we're going to get 5 SEC teams in. I just really don't.
Outside of like Notre Dame losing or something like that.
We need a nuclear scenario for that to happen. And I don't think we get 5 SEC teams in. Right now, there's a very strong potential that we have 5 or more 10-2 teams in the SEC. So someone is going to be the odd man out. If you have a resume that doesn't differentiate itself, if you have not gotten a top 25 win, which again, we're not picking on you here, Chaiki, but we're projecting. You say that they have a 96% chance to make it. Right now they do because they're projected to win their last 2 games. If they go 11-1 and are in the SEC championship game, it's a 100% chance to win.
Yeah.
Go. What we're saying is, if they're 10, strength of record is not, strength of record is based on wins and losses more than it is the strength of schedule. So what we're saying is if they're 10-2 and don't have a top 25 win, it's going to be risky because they're going to be compared against other 10-2 SEC teams. The resume works until it's compared. The resume works until it's compared to another resume that might be better.
Well, and
so it works really in a vacuum right now on November 19th. But if it's compared head to head and the committee values something that you don't have, it's the lowest in the SEC in quite some time. That's
right. The point really is Texas should find a way to make it, right? Really, they should find a way to make it at this point. They're ranked so highly that outside of a collapse, they'll find their way in probably, right? It's the ultimate point here is you don't want to leave it up to the committee, right? If you're Texas and you go 10-2 and you don't beat A&M at the end of the season, you're ending your season on a loss, and you have to have a bye week basically before, letting the committee make their final decision after conference championship weeks. And anything can happen in a conference championship week, right? Like, what happens if, let's just go on the crazy scenario, right? What happens if Indiana beats Ohio State? Are you dropping Ohio State all the way out of the playoffs?
That's Probably the one I was going to bring up next. Right. And I'm really glad you said that, because if Indiana beats Ohio State does have a win over Penn State. And that's a really nice win to have in your back pocket. So I don't think that drops them completely out, but they would have no business hosting a playoff game if they lose to Indiana. And likewise, Indiana should be locked into hosting a playoff game.
And then what I'm saying is, so if Indiana, beats Ohio State, let's just put that on the table. I don't think that'll happen, just by the way, but let's just say that happens. If Indiana beats Ohio State, they will go to the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State will be in a similar situation as Texas. But when you compare the two, it's going to be hard to look at both of them and then say, like, oh, well, like, who did you beat? And then Ohio State having a win over a probable playoff team in Penn State versus Texas having a win over maybe Vanderbilt, or, the Florida win was good. Florida's looking better. Maybe that's their best win. Arkansas, possibly. Like, you're starting to pick, a little bit of a rough situation for Texas there, because they're having to justify themselves, winning or finishing the season on a loss and then winning their way out, trying to go upward momentum. They just might have too much downward momentum. If you combine that with maybe Colorado winning, and so they get the bid because it's the Big 12, And then you have to figure out what to do with BYU, which I do think they would drop out, but right now they're currently in.
Well, the Big 12 and ACC, I think the message has been sent. You're getting one team in each.
Right.
And be happy with it.
But again, like you could find there's teams along the cut line right now that you could justify. Like if SMU wins out, do you drop Miami all the way out? Maybe.
Yeah, they'll drop out.
Probably. But
yeah, because you've already seen it though. Because like Miami,
you don't want. But my point is, you don't want to leave it in the hands of the committee. If you're any of these teams, Texas, Indiana, Notre Dame, Alabama, like any of these teams that are sort of we have a glaring problem on our resume. You don't want any of them to sit there and say, well, I hope the committee looks more favorably on me, because at that point you're going to find yourself at 13 and feel left out, right? That's really the point that I'm trying to make is you have to make your case and you have to stake your claim. And this is a bigger conversation about the 12-team playoff. The 12-team playoff, at my point, there's no more sympathy, right? You could make the case in previous iterations of this that team number 5 got screwed, right? We talked about Florida State, right? Florida State got screwed, right? They should have been in. They won their conference. They go undefeated, all that stuff. Doesn't matter that they lost a quarterback. There's 21 other starters. We had that whole conversation. 13 doesn't get to complain, right? If you're let's say that you're Indiana, you get left out. Texas gets left out. Tennessee gets left out. Whoever it is that ends up with a short straw. Well, don't lose those games. If you're Tennessee, don't lose to Arkansas, right? You don't get to complain. You lost to Arkansas. If you're, Texas that gets left out. Well, you didn't beat a quality team, right? Your best win is Vanderbilt, so shut up, right? If it's Indiana, well, you didn't beat Ohio State, and your best win is maybe Michigan by 5 points. Congratulations. That doesn't mean anything, right? Like that's what I'm saying is if you leave it in the hands of the committee, you're going to find yourself left out, but you can't complain at this point because 13 doesn't get that right anymore to really say that they were deserving. And that's the benefit of the 12-team playoff.
All right, let's get out of here on this, Garrett, because I think we've got a lot to talk about in our preview show that'll we'll record tomorrow, and it'll drop in your podcast feed and on YouTube on Thursday. So make sure that you are subscribed. Garrett, I want you to give me one game this weekend where you want the underdog to win just to see what kind of playoff carnage happens.
Oh, man. I mean, it might be Indiana. That might be the situation because then you have to sort of rank the Big Ten, decide how much all those wins mean. I mean, it might be Indiana. I could say, might give a little shout out, kind of going back to the top of the show. Kansas, they could do some damage here. It would be fantastic for Kansas to play spoiler 3 weeks in a row, right? And just say like, no, this whole conference is going down and it's my fault. Like that would be something to behold.
Yeah, I think I want to see something off the wall. I think rivalry week is around the corner too, and we're not gonna get out of the woods there, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's gonna be something just insane that happens, a la 2007 when not like a 5-win Pitt team knocked off West Virginia at home. Give me Army knocking off Notre Dame if I just want to see pure carnage and just see what the community has to do, because I think twofold that would create a bunch of big dominoes. One, I think Notre Dame would fall out, so that creates another at-large spot. And I think that would put the Big 12 in serious jeopardy if certain other things happen. I really want to see what the committee has to do if Army knocks off Notre Dame. So that's the one I'm rooting for the hardest, just from a fear chaos standpoint. We're going to close out on this question from Chaiki in the chat. And don't apologize for a late question, my friend. That's what we're here for. Yeah. If Texas
had still live, do it.
Yeah. If Texas had beaten Georgia but had lost to Vandy and Oklahoma, would they be in the top 10? That is the equivalent of what they are doing with Ole Miss. That's a fascinating question and a fascinating case study, honestly, because if the value, again, I think what we're trying to say here with the whole SEC conundrum is they're all very similar. Mm-hmm. And because this is the first 12-team playoff, we just don't know what the committee is going to do. We can try to make decisions based on what the 4-team versions have done, but we don't know what they're going to do. If they value quality wins, I would compare that more so because Ole Miss's losses are to LSU on the road and Kentucky at home. So this would be Oklahoma on a neutral field and Vanderbilt on the road. I mean, that win over Georgia would be loud, and you'd be talking about a 3-loss Georgia team at this point. So the domino ripple effect would be Georgia moving up a little bit. I don't think Texas would be in the top 3 in the college football playoff, but ironically, if they value quality wins and are willing to forgive a couple of losses, which is what it looks like they're willing to do for the SEC, I don't know. I really don't know how they'd handle that. It'd be a really fascinating case study.
I personally think they would drop out, similar in sort of the Ole Miss vein. They might be around 10 or like 9 or 10 or something like that, right? But yeah. I think it'd be fringe. But I kind of just don't agree with the Ole Miss thing. I think right now you have to validate, wins. I don't know if that's true yet. Like that might be wrong. And we'll figure out real quick what the committee thinks, right? If they value wins or if they value losses. But I think that's going to be kind of the thing to really keep your eye on, right? I'm glad that you brought it up because that's been my question almost the entire year is, well, are they going to look at, a team like Georgia who, they got the quality win versus Texas, but, maybe a couple of not so good losses, but, okay teams. I mean, they lost to Bama and Ole Miss. That's, good teams that they've lost to. Or are they going to kind of go the other direction and say like, oh, well, right now Ole Miss is ranked higher. They didn't beat Georgia, but have the more embarrassing loss on the schedule, right? Georgia doesn't have the embarrassing Kentucky loss on the schedule. So it probably has to do with that. It also probably has to do with time of the year, right? If Texas loses the games at the end of the year that are embarrassing versus Ole Miss losing the games at the beginning of the year that's embarrassing, again, easier to justify the beginning stuff because the team's peaking, right? Ole Miss is peaking right now. Whereas, if that were the case and, Texas is losing Oklahoma and Vanderbilt, like in that scenario, that would be losses middle of the schedule, which are harder to justify. Even worse would be if they did lose to A&M or Kentucky towards the end of the year. And that's even harder to justify those late season, sort of losses. So it's going to be interesting because we don't have a frame of reference, right? But the good news is we do have 12 spots to play with. And that's going to ensure that the best team gets in. I think it's fair to say that the best team will not be left out. The best team will have a chance to prove themselves this year. I don't know if that's Oregon. I don't know if that's Ohio State. Could be Indiana, right? Heck, I mean, it might still be BYU. Right now they got a spot. But somebody is going to be the best team in the country this year, and they're going to be in the playoff, right? The best team will not be sitting there at 13.
Well, let's get out of here on that. We will be back in your podcast feed or on your YouTube feed on Thursday morning with our Week 13 preview. So many big games, so many games that have massive playoff implications, and so many just sneaky games that could jump up and get you that you're not really expecting, maybe especially if you're looking ahead to a big rivalry game next week. All that and more on our preview show. For Garrett Turney, I'm Trey Reeves. We'll talk to you guys later.
Gracious him. How about